My name's Chuck Holland. These stories are about transactional analysis legacy. And each one of you, including Van, are peers in that foundation. And I'm thankful for that. With me today is Pam Levin. She's a registered nurse. She's a training and supervising transactional analyst and was the first RN to become a TSTA. And she will probably tell us that another first. Laurie Weiss, PhD, also a TSTA. And Jonathan Weiss, PhD, TSTA. It was exciting to me to read you guys' bios. They're very creative. Pam in hers makes a statement that nature and human life unfolds through cyclical developmental seasons. And I might add that for her work in child development and adult development, she won the prestigious Eric Byrne Memorial Scientific Award in 1984. And Jonathan and Laurie, we are in big company today because Van Joins won the Eric Byrne Memorial Scientific Award in 1994 for his work with personality adaptations. Laurie in her bio made a wonderful statement. Laurie, you said, my life has been richer, fuller, and more exciting than I ever could have imagined. And you mentioned two serendipitous accidents that I hope will be in your story today. We want to know about those. And in Jonathan's bio, he mentioned that in his TA 101, David Cooper cured him of his doctoral dissertation in 2 transactions, and he said details upon request. So I'm asking for those requests. Van, Jonathan, and I usually were in attendance at the TA conferences for the men's meetings in the early morning. We passed the talking stick and talked about what was going on with us. And humorously, anytime we ventured close to the game of Ain't It Awful, Jonathan found a way to pull us back in, and we didn't quite get there. Thank you for that, Jonathan.
My pleasure.
Pam, will you tell us what's on the top of your head that you want expressed about your bio today? A little bit more introduction about yourself.
Well, I just was reviewing today that I've been involved in transactional analysis for 55 years. And I am so grateful for that, because had I not found TA or TA found me, I can't imagine what my life would have been like, both personally and professionally, and as a parent also. So when I found TA or TA found me, I had graduated from the University of Illinois College of Nursing in 1964 and passed my board. So I was a newly minted RN and newly married also. And I worked at the VA hospital in Boston, and then my husband only got every other weekend off, but I got every 5th weekend. So I was looking for how could I get a weekend so I could be with my husband. So that led me into, as speaking of serendipity, that led me into going into alcohol rehab, because I got weekends off. Then he was drafted and went to flight surgery school in Pensacola, Florida. So I got a job with the state of Florida, seeing if nursing services could be utilized for outpatient alcohol rehab. And then while I was doing that, it was 6 months in Pensacola, I heard that somebody on the West Coast was claiming to cure alcoholics. And I thought that was amazing. And then my husband got sent to California on the way to Vietnam. And a friend in Chicago handed me Games People Play and said, here, you've got to read this. So I did on the way out to California. And then I had been here a short amount of time and he got sent to Vietnam. And I said to a new friend, I said, I've got to get a job. And she said, well, what would you do if you could do anything? I thought that was the most amazing question. She was being flip, I thought. So I just flipped right back. And I said, I'd do anything for Eric Berne. She says, oh, I'll get you introduced to him. I thought, yeah, right, you will. But she did. And I started attending the seminars, and that was in 1966.
Thank you for that. Laurie, will you tell us what's on your mind right now to fill in some of your bio?
Okay. Like Pam, my world was completely turned upside down by encountering TA, and it was wonderful. But I came from a very different kind of perspective. I was mom of a 2-year-old. Jonathan was working on his PhD, and I was teaching school part-time, and he was going to California for training. And along the way, he had handed me a book called Games People Play, which I thought was pretty fun. And so I read it, and that was very interesting. And so I knew kind of what he was doing, and we went along. And I also got to go to a lecture of a really weird guy called Eric Berne, who sat there pounding his thumb and saying, doctor, my thumb hurts, doctor, my thumb. I was like, what? It was interesting. It was fun. So we went out there, and I was to take care of the 2-year-old while Jonathan was in training, and was enjoying myself thoroughly. There were several other families there. Men were in training. The women were taking care of children. And somebody said, there's a conference coming up. Why don't we get a babysitter and go to the conference? Well, that sounded like a good idea. So we did. And the first thing that happened was I heard Muriel James presenting a paper. And I was stunned. I did not know that women could be so powerful and present in the world. I had no experience of that, even though I had a powerful mother, but nothing like that. So that was my introduction. And then I think the first evening I was there was a party at Eric Berne's house. And in that party, somebody started yelling, no touching, no touching. Were you there, Pam?
No, but I know this story.
Okay, it was in 16.
Well, maybe I was there, actually. I don't know. I might have been in the other room. I didn't see this.
Okay,
actual.
Well, he started yelling, no touching, and people started jumping on him. And then I was there. I was in that pile and never done anything like that before in my life. It was absolutely stunning. And I got untangled, and then I went and hid under the table and got hysterical for a while. And then came out. And then the next day, I went to a workshop, a permission workshop with Ursula Steiner. And we were busy killing the witch parent. And people were in a conga line singing Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. And just dancing out. And it's like, okay, this is really cool. And plus, people were talking to me like I was a real person, not just a wife, not just, an auxiliary, but a person in my own right. And I was completely stunned by it. And so when we went home, it was like, I got to learn this. And so the first thing I did was, as soon as there was another 101 in Chicago where we lived, Fanita English and Dave Kupfer were teaching it. And I signed up. And had an amazing time. Fanita was absolutely wonderful. Dave taught a lot. Fanita gave a lot of strokes, which I really loved. And then I begged to go to the TA seminar in Chicago. And they didn't want to let me because all I had was a BA. I was a teacher. But they finally let me in. I begged long enough and I got to go. And then Maury Hamowitz changed my life with a transaction. I stumbled over something and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm so clumsy." And he said, "Who told you you were clumsy?" And I went, "What?" Total shock. And I was hooked. And by that time I was, let's see, there was a marathon with Dave Kupfer. And I was doing all of this not because I was in training for anything, but just because this stuff was wonderful. So we did a weekend marathon with Dave Kupfer sometime in the winter. And I was pregnant then with my second child. By the time Natalie Hamowitz and Fanita English were doing several days training, sometime in the summer, I was very, very pregnant. And I was learning, I was soaking up everything like crazy. And in between, I was lying on the floor and doing prenatal exercises. And Fanita English, in her nylon stockings and dress, lay down on the floor with me and did them with me. And the affirmation that kept happening was just incredible.
Jonathan, what's on the top of your head about your bio today?
Well, I wanted to fill in about Dave Kupfer. My introduction to TA started with books. Somebody handed me TA and psychotherapy when I was an intern. And I read it and I thought it was quite interesting. While I was reading it, Games People Play came out. And I read Games People Play and fell out of my chair laughing and thought, something that makes this much sense and is this funny is something I want part of. I want to be part of it. I remember Eric at some point saying that people would hear laughter coming out of his conference room and were offended by it. And he said he thought laughter was a feeling and he should be producing feelings anyway. So when Dave Kupfer and Bob Goulding came to Chicago to do a 101, I took it. And in those days, part of the 101 was demonstration groups where either Dave or Bob would run the group and the participants would be participants in the group. So I was at the time working on my doctoral dissertation. And so the problem I presented to Dave Kupfer was that I was obsessing about my dissertation, not getting it done. And then in the process of telling him that, I was obsessing about obsessing. And I was just going on, and he interrupted me. And he said, "John," I said, "What?" He said, "Who's going to do your dissertation?" I said, "I am." He said, "That's right. Who else wants to work?"
Oh.
I had never actually said I was going to do it.
Thank you for that story.
And as it happened, that particular week that I was in that 101, 3 days earlier in that week, I was in a group process workshop with some very heavy hitter from the East Coast. And my experience was that we spent 3 days talking about how nice it would be if we ever trusted each other enough to talk to each other. And the contrast between that and the power of TA was, absolutely set the hook. This is a process that actually accomplishes something.
Thank you. Pam, is there more detail to your discovery of TA and of Eric Byrne, and what grabbed you there?
Initially, as I said, it was the fact that I when on my way to California, I figured out that the people that were claiming to cure alcoholics and the games people playbook were the same people. So when I got to California, I was like, oh man, this is fantastic. But the idea that I could ever hook up with any of those people or train in that way, it was just an impossibility. It was like, off in the ozone. But that little remark that I made to my friend, I got to get a job. What would you do if you could do anything? I'd do anything for Eric Byrne. Oh, okay, I got you introduced. So she knew a social worker who was going to the seminars, and you had to have a contract of confidentiality in order to attend the seminars. And since I was an RN and had that contract of confidentiality, I qualified. And so I was allowed to go, even though at that time, well, actually, I didn't find out till later that that they didn't really have a training program, but I was told they had a training program. And it turned out I might have been the first one to do that training program. I don't know. But anyway, initially the games and the idea that someone could actually make sense of what goes on between people and make sense of it in a way that was constructive and then help people relate in a better way, in a less obtuse way, let's say, a less abusive way, that was fantastic. But then later, when I actually attended the seminars, it was a total mind blower to me and life-changing to learn about 3 ego states. Because up to that time, I was, 21, 22, something like that. And my internal world was just a morass of feelings and needs and wants and criticism and desire, and I couldn't make any sense of it. And the minute I learned about ego states, it was like somebody said, this goes here, that goes there, this is what you do about this, that goes there. And if you had been able to see my brain rework, I think I would, just knowing ego states rewired my brain, or I rewired my brain, sorting out ego states. It was incredible.
You got it.
Yeah. And then later it was scripts,
Yes.
And the fact that, I was living some kind of life story instead of some authentic self that I wanted to be. And I didn't understand that. And then I got to studying scripts. And at that time in the seminar, Eric was studying scripts also, and Writing Scripts People Live, I think, or is that the name of the book? Yeah. And I was sneaking out of the seminar at the end. I didn't like to get involved in all the mess afterwards. And he loved to catch people doing that. So he caught me at the door and he said, so Pamela, what do you think about how people develop scripts? And like, me? So, I had one hand on the doorknob and one foot out the door, and I just said, well, I think that first we have to know how people develop and then how people develop scripts. And he looked at me and he said, yes. And I just took that as my assignment. I don't know why, if he meant it that way or he didn't, but that became my life work.
Love that.
Wow.
Laurie, any more in your discovery story? We already know a bunch.
Well, when I went back to Chicago, I was working in a private school. I was teaching science in a parochial school. And I decided that I could teach TA to the children. I was teaching junior high school. So I started doing that, and it made perfect sense. They got it very quickly, very easily. And one of the things that they were doing, they had a great deal of trouble with another teacher who kept turning on parent and giving them extra homework and being very mean to them. So I suggested that we plan a way that they could relate differently to that teacher. And I think what they did was they decided that they would be very nice to her and start nurturing her. And they did, and she completely changed. And they were thrilled, and I was thrilled, and I just went on from there.
Yeah, the antithesis of kick me is kiss him.
Mm-hmm.
So well, that's what they did.
I wasn't that clear yet, but I knew about ego stakes, and we could do that together.
Jonathan, what else in your discovery story do you want to say today?
Well, I was thinking when you asked Pam about what grabbed her about TA, the thing that kept grabbing me about TA was the sense of humor in it.
Mm-hmm.
I identified completely with Burns' talk about taking the Martian approach. And, you know, what a stranger from another planet here looking around saying, what are these people doing? And I identified with that, not only because it was funny, but because it fit me, because I had been through school on an off schedule throughout my entire education career. So I didn't get locked into the same pattern of becoming a graduate assistant and stuff like that everybody else did. So I was sort of off schedule. I started public school off schedule. But back to the humor thing. I remember seeing Eric Byrne give a lecture at the Institute of Juvenile Research in Chicago. And he would say something, and then all the nurses in the room would laugh, and the doctors would go, you know, they would be offended. And 2 sentences later, he would say something else, and all the doctors would laugh. And the nurses would go, and like that. And I admired his ability to offend people equally with a sense of humor. And I just found that very attractive because I've always looked at the way us human beings operate as being very absurd anyway. And it just sort of matched my way of looking at the world.
It's very interesting, I think, for us to talk and think and bring up our mentors and those who taught us. Pam, will you tell a little more about those that you studied with during the time getting ready to pass your boards when nobody else had to?
Yeah, I didn't know that at that point, luckily. I was attending the TA seminars. My husband was in Vietnam, as I said. He was a flight surgeon and had been drafted. And so no one at the seminars had met him. And so the typical way that women, that the world and men in particular related to women at that time was either you could be a dancing girl or you could be smart. And so I just like to smear that and do both. You know, if they were expecting me to be a dancing girl, I tried to say something smart and vice versa. And so they didn't quite know what to make of me, probably. I don't really know. But I got very serious about wanting to become a clinical member. And I said that, and Claude Steiner said, well, of course we want nurses to be clinical members, but they always quit. And I thought, you just watch me.
Ooh.
You just watch me. And so maybe he cured me of quitting right there, because I got really rebellious and I was not going to quit. So the next issue was I had to get 2 groups for a year. Well, that was a big challenge, but I also needed a sponsor, and nobody would sponsor me. Well, later on, I found out that there was a rumor going around the seminar that I had invented this flight surgeon husband who was supposedly in Vietnam, and that I was psychotic. And therefore, they didn't want anything to, you know, they weren't going to have me be a clinical member. But I didn't know that until later, you know, but that's the kind of barriers that got put up. Turns out later, they didn't want nurses to become clinical members because at that time, there were 450 unemployed social workers in the Bay Area alone. And they didn't want nurses to come in and compete even more for the clients that might engage in private practice. So anyway, my husband finally came home and I brought him. I said, you are the corpus delicti. And you have to come to the seminar. So not only did he come to the seminar, but he was a researcher, an MD immunologist, and on the staff at UC San Francisco at the medical center. And Eric wanted the scientific community to validate TA. So he tried to recruit my husband. So all of a sudden I became a means for them, to try to get Alan to move from immunology to validating TA. So anyway, I finally got a sponsor who was Joe Concannon, and that was only because my husband was in the Navy. So I got 2 groups for a year out at Oakland Naval Hospital under Joe Concannon, and he was a real sweetheart. He wasn't part of that scene at all. I would go to him and say, after group, Joe, and this was my supervision, Joe, this client said this and stuff, and he's, and he might, he's threatening to harm his wife or whatever. And Joe would say, that's right, dear, and he had a cigarette that was dangling the ash. And that was my supervision pretty much. So, what I learned by the seat of my pants, and also going back to the seminars every week and really trying to figure out what was going on and what to do. So I learned, when in doubt, keep asking questions of the client, and it turned out to be a fantastic approach.
Can you believe they wrote all that down in those seminars, or they took such good notes to put the bulletin together? Who actually did that?
Well, it was different people who were contributing, but Eric did the first. He did the bulletin first of all, and then there were Claude Steiner, Joe. I don't know if Joe. I can't see it. Did anything? Pat Crossman, Muriel James, Ken Everett's. It's bound now. Let's see. I remember a teeny little, yeah. So.
Everything that I hear about San Francisco social psychiatric seminars, and then the change. What was the name change?
The Eric Byrne Seminars of San Francisco. That was after he died.
Okay.
It was the San Francisco Social Psychiatry Seminars.
That's such an interesting time period in history.
Yes, right down the street was the Haight-Ashbury, and the Summer of Love was happening, and the Vietnam War protests, and it was cultural foment in every way.
At one of the conferences, Carol Solomon took me on a tour that I will cherish, to people's houses and where you guys met, and it was a wonderful day. Laurie, tell us more about your training.
Well, it was very haphazard because I didn't know I was training. After Jonathan got his PhD, we moved to Denver, and so did a couple, Warden and Carolyn Reimel, who were part of the Chicago TA seminar, and decided to start TA here in Colorado. And so they were professionals. Carolyn was a social worker, Warden was a psychiatrist, and John was a psychologist. And I was part of the group, but I was a stay-at-home mom at that point with two babies. And so I got to do all the work of making the seminar happen, in terms of making sure that we had everything we needed for every seminar, and said hello to people and got everything going. And so we had a seminar in Denver, and that was interesting. So we moved here in 1969, and I think it was in 1971 that we did a winter conference here. We'd gone back to California in the summer. I don't remember exactly. But we set up a winter conference here, and Bob and Mary Goulding came and did a 3 or 4 day workshop before the conference. I got to work with them for the first time. It was wonderful. Somebody must have been taking care of the children because I wasn't. No idea. And I just kept keeping on. And then one day we were in California, and I was sitting somewhere with Natalie Hamowitz and a group of women, and they were going over when people were going to take exams. I took my first clinical exams in 1972. And at that time, I was going through an unsteady period. I was very, very scared. And I took the exam with not a lot of confidence. And I also didn't know something. I didn't know anything at all about psychopathology. I knew everything I needed to know about TA, but nothing about psychopathology. And so they couldn't figure out what to do with me. And I don't remember, I think I got a special membership rather than a limited clinical membership at that time. We had been teaching a lot. I'd been teaching a lot of TA, introducing a lot of people to TA. And that summer, that was in January, in the summer, Jonathan was responsible for teaching the 101 at summer conference. And there were a whole bunch of breakout sessions, and I was leading one of them. And so I was called, in the meantime, I'd studied psychopathology, of course, but I was called out of my breakout session to take my exam. And I decided that these were the people that were in my breakout session. I could handle them. There was no problem. I was being very confident, very comfortable. So I went in and I passed everything. I lied about one thing, which is about the level of psychosis that I was willing to teach. So I got a nearly perfect score because I wasn't working with that level of psychosis yet. And I was. And Marty Haken, who had chaired both exams, said, "What happened to you in that period of time?" So then I was a clinical member. And at that point I'd been studying with you, Pam, I think, for a while at that point, and with Jackie Schiff and a number of other people. And for about 2 years, John and I had been going across the country explaining Jackie Schiff's material to people, because we apparently could teach it coherently and people would get it and start using it. And we were also working with the Little Rock, Arkansas school project, introducing TA in the schools. Along the way, Ken Ernst and I had been talking about real teaching members who were teachers and knew how to do it, and teaching members who, were teaching TA but didn't know how to teach. And I'd been working with schools and having a good time with that. And so I took my teaching membership, and I'm not remembering, Jack Doucet and Claude Steiner, and I don't remember who else. Oh, at that point they had divided it into 2 boards. 2 teaching boards, not just 1 teaching membership exam, but 2. And so Mary Goulding was in 1, and somebody said, "Are you a redecision therapist?" And I was explaining how I incorporated developmental work into redecision work, and Mary looked at them and said, "She's a redecision therapist." And that got me through that part of the exam pretty comfortably. In the other part of the exam, they had decided that to make the exam almost exclusively about Tabby Kaler's work, theory part of the exam. And I was not really strong on Tabby Kaler's work. And I remember Bill Holloway saying to me at the end, "Well, it's a pass, but it's a weak pass." And I thought, I don't care, it's a pass. So those were my adventures with exams.
Thank you. Well, Pam, will you start and talk about your boards, your experience of your boards? And
Well, for my clinical membership boards, Claude Steiner was the director of the board. There were 5 people on the board, and they asked me questions that were standard TA questions. And I mean, usually I didn't feel like I did very well on things like that, but I came out feeling like I did very well. And I was really pleased. And then they flunked me.
huh,
And I wanted to know why. Well, you knew the answers, but you knew them too well. So I said, well, I'm not going to flunk. You know, that feeling of I'm not going to quit. You're going to try and make me quit, and I'm not going to quit. And so they said, well, you can always appeal. And I said, okay, I appeal. What's the procedure? Oh, well, we don't have one yet. So they invented an appeal procedure. And part of it was I got to take my exam again for free at the next conference, which was 6 months later. So then at that conference, they passed me, but they gave me limited clinical membership. So that my exam was on Friday night, and it turns out they couldn't pass the limited clinical membership category until the business meeting on Sunday. So it didn't even exist when they were offering it to me. So anyway, I said, you know, if this happens again, I will come and I will be accompanied by my lawyer. I don't know where I got the nerve to say this. But anyway, finally, I got clinical membership and I didn't have to take another exam. And then I got challenged again in a very similar fashion when I came up for teaching membership. And again, I had to threaten that I would be bringing my attorney because I knew I had passed and I had done well. And so I got it kind of by virtue of just surviving the raising that was going on. It was like a fraternity hazing. You can survive this. But, you know, it did serve me because I had been a very mousy nurse when I started this whole process. And by the end of it, I had my voice, my agency, and I wasn't going to take any garbage. So, you know, it trained me in the way that I needed to be trained emotionally, even if I didn't like it.
that's so unique, and it chokes me a little bit. We could say so much more about that right now. Thank you for the gutsy way you experienced that and told it. Jonathan, jump in there about your boards.
Well, let's see. My clinical boards, I think were in 68. I'm not sure. What I remember is that at
69.
the time, 69, okay.
January, I think.
Okay, that your sponsor was supposed to come in with you and introduce you and like that. My sponsor was Natalie Hamowitz at the time, and she couldn't make the conference. It was in Santa Anita in California because it was halfway between San Francisco and Los Angeles. And the exam before me was Anita Rogenbuck, and she took her exam, passed it, came out, turned around and sponsored me to take the exam. So that all worked out very well. I don't remember anything about the exam. I remember more about my teaching exam, which was in 71. And I remember Jack Doucet asking me why I had played late paper with my application. And I told him it was because the office lost the first set of papers. That seemed to be sufficient. Eric had labeled me the satrap of Colorado. I had to look it up to see what that meant.
Yeah, whether you were being insulted or not.
Right.
Say it again. What did he?
Satrap.
Satrap. SATRAP. Apparently means the highest level government official on the scene. Because we had created a substantial TA community with our TA seminars. It met twice a month for 7 years, and was very popular. And it was actually our marketing plan for private practice, but we didn't know it at the time.
I'd like to acknowledge you and Laurie both, because you were the first ones to get the developmental material that I was producing and invited me to my very first out-of-town weekend, where I was paid to go and teach a Friday night public event and do a marathon over the weekend. And I remember
about that.
Yeah, you launched my whole teaching member career at that
point.
Well,
we were so impressed with you applying the developmental stuff in an outpatient setting, because we were familiar with the way Jackie was doing it in a residential setting. And you provided a model that provided the model for our practice for the next 10 years.
Well, that was wonderful. I remember you came to visit my group, when you were out in Berkeley. And we asked you not to talk during the group, but to comment afterwards. And your comment, John, was, how do you get him to leave?
I remember you had a guy in that group who had designed the Transamerica Pyramid.
Yes, that's right.
The other thing I remember about when you came out to Colorado was that I knew I was going to be in the marathon with you. And 2 or 3 days before the marathon, I had a dream which totally resolved what I was going to work on in the marathon. I was so relieved I wasn't going to have to deal with it, whatever it was.
Oh, I just did it long distance, John.
Something like that. The laying on of hands from a distance. Those were good times.
Yes. I remember you and Virginia Satir confronting me about something or other and hanging in there with me for a really long time. We were sitting on a bed somewhere. I have no idea when or what, but I knew that I was later. I knew that I had been not doing something assertive, and you wanted me to, and I finally figured it out.
I think it probably, I never knew Virginia Satir, so it wasn't.
Oh, no, it wasn't. It was Virginia Hilliker. Hilliker. That's who it was. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I got my Virginia.
And you were really, you were really early on board with the women's oppression and psychiatry and liberating yourself. Yeah, so it was probably something about that. But
yeah, it was that very first time in, Hoagie Wyckoff recruited me. Yeah. And when Valerie stood up in the general
Valerie
meeting,
Langford, we shut down the convention.
I was there.
I know you were.
I didn't know exactly what was going on, but I was there.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say something else about trainers and mentors. When we had I had my 101 with David Kupfer and Bob Goulding, and that was what decided me to go out to California to get training, because they were the Carmel TA Institute at the time. By the time I got there the following summer, they had split up. So I wound up taking half of my training with Dave Kupfer and half of it with Bob Goulding, Bob and Mary. And later on, I'd had more training with Bob and Mary, and we had cathexis training. And once again, I wound up with my feet in 2 different camps. And that seemed to be something that carried through the rest of our practice of seeing the value and the approach of the redecision work versus the parenting work versus the developmental work, not versus, but with the developmental work, and allowed us, I think, to integrate at a level that we probably wouldn't have been able to do if we'd done just a straight path. We had a pretty good sized community. We brought out quite a few people to do things in that community. I don't know if we started with Pam, but probably not.
Yeah, that was a really vibrant community, wonderful place to go and be welcomed as the visiting what were we called at the time? I don't know. Eric had a word for us.
I don't know, but we had a bed in our house that almost every senior TA person wound up sleeping in.
But not at the same time.
No,
Not at the same time.
not at the same time.
We've so slept in group rooms all over the country.
And the world.
Yes.
There was more power in that that energy that you guys put into the women's movement, the early women's movement in TA. And Val Chang and I were talking before the first Zoom, and we were talking about where did we do a good job with diversity in the beginning and where did we not. And I give you guys a lot of credit, you too, for keeping the woman's part going and actually being a loving kind of confrontation to that the world of males. And
the timing was perfect,
I
think. And I went home from that conference and said, I learned this, and I introduced it to all the women in our community.
Oh, wonderful.
And we, at that point, we had the passivity confrontation and we had the women's movement. And what we decided to do was we would not let the men get by with anything. We decided we would not let any sexist remark go unchallenged. We did it nicely. And we recruited the men, who could see it was to their advantage in the long run. But it was a very, very interesting period in which a lot of women and a lot of men were learning at the same time.
Yeah, it took some doing to separate out men whom we loved from patriarchy that was oppressive.
the process.
And when we met, our women's caucuses were incredibly supportive for us all.
And transformative.
Yes. I mean, we could talk about things there that we had never ventured in any way to talk about elsewhere. We just didn't.
And having the tools of TA to do it with too, which was fantastic.
Yeah. I remember one in Mexico where the translators were crying so hard that they had to switch back and forth. Gloria and
Gloria Noriega.
Gloria Noriega and Patricia.
Tracy Rincon.
Yeah. And they were switching back and forth because they were crying so much.
I remember in San Francisco in 1977 was the first time I had ever heard a group of women laugh. And I still have that sound in my ear. It was transformative. I had never, and as you probably recall, Laurie, men kept trying to crash our women's caucus, and so we learned to unite as a group and say no, create our own boundary. That was huge. It took a lot of work in our developing community in order to get united enough to do that.
And it was a developmental cycle for all of y'all and for all of us. I mean, it was, you led the way in some ideas. You mentioned that conference of 1977. My wife and I were there together, and I had a training group and a motorhome outside with some lived there. We had one hotel room and one motorhome. And I think 8 of us. And it was quite an experience for my wife. And I think she was in that laughing group. I'll check with her a little bit later. But that also was the conference where our son, who is now about to turn 43, was conceived. So it was a memorable time in our lives. The training group all there together, but it was a powerful time too. It was. I like sevens and 7 years after Eric's death, but Jonathan, we played some big part too, and I think in the women's movement. I know you have, and in the men's movement. So the four of us here have put much energy into being the best of our gender that we possibly can, and being a catalyst to each other.
Well, it was nice to discover that I really like powerful women.
Yes.
And it was so nice for us to discover that there were men who would be protective of our having agency and being able to make our own decisions and think for ourselves. That was, wow. How do we get more of this?
This would be a good place to say that I picked up the 1977 journal and looked at it. It happened to be the Woman's Journal. And a woman named Laurie Weiss wrote an article on confrontation, when to confront. And a woman named Pam Levin wrote an article on women's oppression.
Women's oppression and psychiatry. Yes.
That was a very historical journal that I appreciated very much. I really thank each of you. You grabbed my heart, each of you, and I think we've each shared a developmental thing together that we value so highly that it's nice to get together and talk about that. And so thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
It has been lovely. Thank you. And thank you for all the work you did to put this together.
Yes.
And Van too in the background.
We've got quite a team, and it certainly is taking a lot more time than what we thought, but I think you are worth it. We are worth it. All of us put energy, and it's time for us to reconnect somewhat like this. And my guess is this is going to grow something else. So thank you each. I'm just going to sign out here and say bye to each of you, but thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. Stay well.
Yes, stay well.